All right, so thanks for coming, guys. Uh, a little bit of a kind of avant-garde presentation talk for this particular conference. This is all about kind of a discussion of a little bit of theory and a little bit of practical advice on what to think about when you're building a website for a new audience. And so the entire thesis of this was Evan and I were sitting down one time after a long day of IE11 bug busting, basically trying to say, what is the right way to end up not spending a tremendous amount of time at the end of our project building for all the edge cases that we should have been thinking about throughout the duration of the project. And so, unfortunately, Evan can't be here. And so this is going to be a little bit more technically light than it normally would be. But I think it still gets the point across. Kind of looking at this, one of the first things to think about when we talk about how we build websites is that we design websites as an in-group. Innately, as people that are builders of the web, as the people with the tools and the knowledge and the capability to create web experiences, we are an in-group. And so what does being an in-group actually mean? Well, we produce things that logically take care of ourselves as an in-group. We build the websites that we want to see in the world, but we don't oftentimes think about what everybody else wants to see in the world or what everybody else is capable of seeing that aren't a part of our in-group. And largely that's a contextual problem, right? Like we have to go in and actually take a lot of effort and a lot of time and a lot of energy to go understand all these other different potential user groups than people that aren't like us that are consuming the web experiences that we build. And this isn't a problem unique to any one individual. This is definitely one of those large systemic existential things that are out there in the world. That when we think about the builders of the web and the consumers of the web, we see a fairly stark contrast. Like, let's take me as an example. So I am not a developer. I am an executive leader. Most of my job is communication, not writing code. And this is what I sit on every single day. Is I have two 4K monitors. I have a gigabit fiber, symmetrical. I have 4G cell service. I have a Pixel 4 XL. I have a MacBook Pro that's only about 2 years old. This is a lot of hardware for somebody that generally does email. Thinking about this, like this is my setup as somebody that pretty much does email and keynote presentations. Likewise, in my life, I have access to stable electricity and I have battery backup systems that allow me to make sure that my phone stays charged and my computer stays on if the power goes out. I have stuff that's not dependent upon my local power grid working 100% of the time. I have a relatively high level of technical savvy. One of the things that is often misinterpreted is how much of a skill in life it is to be able to fill out a web form. When we think about people that are looking for receiving assistance or don't have access to their own PC and have to go to, say, a public library or something like that. There's a lot of these rote skills in technology that are simply absent from those people's cognitive capabilities. And it's not like they're unable to do these work. It's just that they don't have the same experience that the people that are building these different web experiences have sort of baked in as a base level of understanding. One of the things to think about there is I use a computer somewhere between 8 and 10 hours a day, pretty much 7 days a week. And so that's a tremendous amount of time spent on the internet with a really good understanding of how technology works and how to use it. I know all the common design patterns. I know all the common design pitfalls. For somebody that is only able to use the internet maybe 2 or 3 hours a week, that's a very different understanding, a very different level of experience with digital technology. Likewise, I'm fortunate. I don't have the need to use assistive technology to be able to experience the digital web around me, but lots of people do. And then also, I pretty much own and control everything about my own technology. I don't have to go to a public library. I don't share a phone or a computer with 8 other people in my household. And then lastly, I'm English, I'm white, or I speak English, I'm white, I was born in the USA, and I live in Oregon. All of those things about my demographic data make me generally different than the average user of the internet. So they're all advantages. They're all things that make me, part of this like relatively elite group of people that is has capabilities that far exceed the average user of the internet. So, like, how does this break down? And how does this apply to actually thinking about the miserable path, right? Well, like, let's take a look at just internet speed as a baseline. So internet speed at my parents' house, they live in rural Oregon, is about 4 megabits per second. They're also capped at 10 gigabytes of bandwidth per month, to the point that it becomes unusably slow after that, and prohibitively costly. The average US internet speed is about 44 megabits a second. My internet speed is about a gigabit per second. But what do we think about when we think about development? Well, most of us, I'm sure, we build the websites using localhost. So how fast is localhost relative to your average internet connection? We're not just talking about a 50-fold increase over my speed. We're talking about megabytes, not megabits, in this conversation. And so the speed of localhost is literally 100 times faster than an internet connection. And that actually skews our perception as we're building these sites of how fast and how performant they really are. Also, if you think about internet usage, this is a really horribly ugly chart from the International Telecoms Union, but it paints a really good picture. As 2018 arrives, somewhere in the neighborhood of 48 out of every 100 households globally use the internet. But if you look at how this has changed, just in basically a period of 5 years, you've seen a huge amount of explosive growth. One of the things to think about with that is 30% of people that use the internet today have used it less than 10 years. So they don't have a giant basis of knowledge to build from. They don't have a deep understanding of how the web was constructed or how it works. And fundamentally, they think about the internet differently than people that have been digital natives. Like we talk a lot about the idea of how millennials in the United States have grown up predominantly online. That's not always the same in every culture and in every group. And it's also not the same for every demographic, even within the United States. So if you think about this from like a global perspective, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 billion people live without stable electricity. And I actually have a really interesting story. I was doing a bunch of user research in Tanzania and Kenya. And this was a while ago, about 10 years ago. But one of the things that was really interesting about doing user research there is that people had multiple cell phones. And the reason why they had multiple cell phones is that they had issues, especially in Tanzania, with power grid stability. So you had to have multiple phones across multiple carriers because at any given time, one of those carriers may be down due to a power outage. Or at any given time, you might not be able to charge your phone for 2 or 3 days until you were able to go to a centralized charging station. All of these things provide a very different basis for an experience for folks that are in Kenya and Tanzania. And if you're trying to reach those users, you have to consider that experience as you're building those sites. Likewise, about 50% of all internet traffic worldwide is mobile. That's a dramatic change over the past 10 years. And I think it just continues to be a hot topic sort of all over the web development world. If you're not thinking about mobile, you're essentially ignoring half your market. And then finally, the average age of computer is also between 5 and 6 years old. My 2-year-old MacBook Pro actually feels dated relative to all the new Apple announcements that just happened recently. But at the same time, it's half the age or less than your average computer that's out in an ecosystem. And then finally, about 1 billion people have an accessibility need worldwide. So that's a lot of stats, but what does all of this mean? Like, how does this actually influence the way that we should think about building experiences? The answer to everything is clearly just React. So this is a decoupled talk, so I have to put a React joke in it about the idea of if we're able to decouple a front end, we have a lot more control over how we formulate and create that front end. The world of JavaScript has really changed things in the way that we think about a lot of these problems, but it's not free of its own sorts of issues. And Addy has been a really great produced this really great both Medium and blog series about the cost of JavaScript. If you haven't read this, I highly recommend it. It talks about the idea of JavaScript and its processing functions causing, in particular with old phones, a really serious burden of performance. And thinking about the ways that we affect that burden of performance is an important consideration as we go about thinking about users. This is normally where Evan would talk a lot about performance, but I'm not necessarily a performance expert. But this all baked into these articles to sort of understand the impacts of performance and JavaScript in your web applications. All of that is kind of building to say, like, as you know, the folks that build the web were not our typical users in most cases. Now, there are occasionally times where you're building a website for a particular group, say an association of web developers, that you can reasonably expect that most of the people there are going to be within the same in-group as you. But the vast majority of time, you're not building a website for you, you're building it for someone else. And if we do this improperly, it has two costs. It has a social cost, which I've talked a lot about, this sort of idea that, by building the web in such a way that we're not considering a more inclusive group of users, we're actually setting ourselves up for a lot of problems. We see groups be marginalized, people be left out, and people be left behind, frequently called the digital divide. And it happens in this country like it does all other countries. And then, to make a more capitalist argument, it excludes a lot of people from a dollar's perspective. If you're the website that has the beautiful, responsive, accessible, well thought out design for a group of people that is marginalized by another website, you're the one that's going to get that traffic, and ultimately the dollars attached to that traffic. So when we talk about the miserable path relative to this, what we really mean is trying to say, like, let's build towards a pathway that is defined by us as the most miserable experience that we could envision for a user on our site. All of these variables and all these different collections of problems and issues and ways of thinking are kind of an intractable challenge. There's this kind of like Gordian knot of stuff you have to consider when you're building a new web experience. And you can't possibly test for every single use case. You can't possibly consider every possible variable. So the way that you combat this from a strategic standpoint is you basically say, like, what is the worst pathway that I could envision? And ideally, you actually base this in research, where you go out and you look at user groups and you understand what that worst miserable path could possibly be. By taking care and building to that miserable path, and then building towards your happy path, which is your typical, in-group, like, what is the best experience I could envision, you handle a tremendous number of those edge cases in between. Now, not all of them. There is still a reason to do usability testing. There's still a reason to actually test with normal people to make sure that you're validating a lot of this stuff. But the miserable path and the happy path and that range in between has a tendency to be very well covered when you think about the worst case scenario. So the first step in this is making some hard choices about your audience and then owning those choices. If you're building a website that is not going to include a particular group of people, or is not designed and built for a particular group of people, making sure that you're aware of that and have an understanding of why that is, and have a lot of really well thought out good reasons for it, is an actual really important first step. And then you also have to understand that you own that, right? If you're, intentionally or unintentionally marginalizing a group of people, you need to understand the reasons for that and also be, like, comfortable with it. Now, that sounds like kind of awful from a perspective of the modern web, but there is a question of resourcing that comes into play. If you are my new favorite tabletop RPG role-playing game of Morkborg, you are a tiny little publishing shop in Sweden that has sort of unintentionally found a global audience. You probably don't have the resources to think about every single potential edge case scenario in the creation of your website. And they've been very intentional about that. Now, Morkborg is not a bastion of accessibility. It's not a bastion of a good idea of the miserable path. It is an incredibly rich, like crazy interactive experience, especially on mobile. The first time I saw the site, I was like, holy cow, that is really amazing. By the way, it has some depictions of violence on the website. So if you're uncomfortable with that sort of thing, please don't go there. It is kept pretty PG-ish, but I do definitely want to call that out, that if that's not your thing, probably not the website for you. But it is definitely a really interesting take on the idea of picking an audience and using their limited resources to address that particular audience. Likewise, when you think about my favorite local coffee shop, which is Proud Mary, this is their experience. Again, not particularly accessible. You could envision something that would be potentially better where, you could have a simple HTML list of items from their menu, or you could have something that looked a little less Tindery in a paradigm of which direction they wanted to go. But this is how they've chosen to spend their resources, and they very much owned that this experience on the web isn't for everyone. Now, those are two examples of groups that are potentially using an understanding of their audience and owning that audience in a positive way. There are other ones that look at it from a little bit of a negative way. Now, Stripe has an incredibly beautiful web experience, but this is something that Stripe needs to be accessible to a very, very broad group of people, and it really isn't. It's hard to see in a static image because this doesn't animate well over the internet. But if you go to stripe.com, like the website is gorgeous if you're me. Or if you're somebody that has a fast internet connection, doesn't need to use accessible devices, and isn't worried about color contrast or anything like that. But when you think about the audience that Stripe has, I would say that this website is a great example of not building towards a miserable path from your audience. This thing is pretty brutal from a in-group inclusivity standpoint. It's definitely built where if you're not looking at this with a modern browser with a fast internet connection, that experience isn't that great. Likewise, and sort of shockingly, Abstract. The payload of the Abstract site is about 100 megabytes. It's a big old site that all kind of loads at once. And it's one of those things that, both from a performance perspective and from just kind of like a cognitive perspective, this site is a real challenge. And so, that's not to say that these sites are inherently bad, but it definitely excludes a group of people that probably should be included in their user base. If I was looking at Abstract and I was somebody that had an accessibility need, and I wasn't well served by this, I would definitely look to try to find a competitor. Likewise with Stripe, I'd look at that from the same perspective. And so that again relates back to that, both like, hey, are we building the right web for everyone? And also like, what is the monetary cost of not doing this the right way? So, the way to combat this is to really develop an environment that mimics your user behavior. This is both for the miserable path and for the happy path. Don't just dev on localhost with a modern web browser. Use things like this. Both Firefox and Chrome have built-in throttling that allows you to understand how a website behaves, across a variety of network speeds and a variety of environments that allow you to sort of understand and put yourself in the shoes of your user. And don't just do this at a test time, like actually dev in this to understand what it feels like to, have to refresh that page 40 times, to understand what it feels like to have to view it in a non-ideal browser in a non-ideal state. Really putting yourselves in the shoes of your user while you're developing is going to make that experience for that miserable path much stronger. That means that progressive enhancement is your friend. So, if you're building something and you're saying like, well, we want to have an inclusive group that includes users for IE11 on 3G internet, spend time building that experience first, and then thinking about what the in-group experience will look like after. So what that means is build for the browser you love at the same time you build for the browser you hate. So don't spend all your time deving in Firefox, and then in the last 10 days of a project, or week of a cycle, flip over and say like, okay, now how does this look in IE? Actually spend time deving in the tool that is ultimately going to be what the miserable path for your user is. Likewise, there is a slew of accessibility tools that are out there that allow you to emulate bad user conditions. There's a whole huge list of them here on W3, which, by the way, has an incredible working group for accessibility that does a lot of really great things to both curate this list of tools and also give people a lot of recommendations and help them out with creating an environment that simulates the user behavior that is unlike theirs. And in the end, what you're going to end up with is you're going to end up with something where you're deving with a screen reader, bad color contrast, throttled internet, and then making sure that everything is viewable in IE11 in a browser on some old phone. And you're going to build the best experience that you can for that pathway. And if it works in that experience, it's probably going to be pretty awesome in every experience that is better than that. So that's like kind of the dev angle, right? Is to try to make it so that everything that you're building is in that sort of worst case scenario, because you inherently are going to take care of that best case scenario. And that affects all of the range of options in between in some meaningful way. But that's just the dev side of it. There's also another side that is a little bit more human driven and thoughtful around okay, so what about the actual behavior of a user? And so what I always encourage is to think about this of use your website when you're pissed off. If you get really upset at some issue, be it your favorite sports team didn't win, but you're just having a bad day, you couldn't get any coffee, you're up late at night, if you're like me, you've got a toddler that just threw a giant tantrum and was really difficult to manage, go try out the website and see what it's like when you're frustrated. And that is the best way to try to understand or put yourself in the shoes of a user that is looking at, say, like a support issue. If you have a frustrating web experience when the site is working perfectly, imagine how frustrating that experience is when the site isn't working perfectly. And so go ahead and fire up your dev instance that has all of these awful, miserable options enabled while you're upset, and then go try to get something done. And go ahead and record yourself doing it. And that'll provide you a ton of insights into user behavior. Similarly, try to think about that fairly frequently from a behavioral perspective. You may have a great, accessible, wonderful UX to get to that web form that has a really simple entry point for a support ticket. But if you haven't tried that pathway when you're actually upset and really in a painful place where you need something, you haven't really tested what it's like to put yourselves in the shoes of that user. There's also a really great example here of Steve Jobs and the iPhone. So one of the things when Steve Jobs was first debuting the iPhone, sort of famously, he had a list of notes that got leaked a little bit later that basically showed that it was a total happy path demo. It was like open the email app, then click the button twice, then go to Maps, then make sure you search for this particular address. And this had been spoon fed to him in this way because the iPhone wasn't ready for market yet. And if you followed this path exactly, it would demo really, really well. But if you didn't follow that path exactly, it would crash, and it would be really embarrassing for him and for Apple on like a pretty big world stage. The demo didn't work unless you followed that happy path. Think about that as an evaluator of a sprint demo, or as someone that is looking at a testing suite, and try to think about that way of sort of digging deeper or being a little bit more curious about the deviations from that happy path. What if you click cancel midway through filling out a web form and invalidate those results? What if you refresh the page on step 3 of a 5-step stepper? How do all of these things affect that ultimate flow and experience of that website? My favorite thing for this is to also think about this in kind of like a decoupled way, right? Like we also now have websites that are based on microservices. And so if you have all of these different microservices that interact with one another, what happens if your personalization service dies? Do you get hello and then an open parens that says username and then a closed parens? Or does it actually substitute it with something that looks like reasonable data for a user? There's this really awesome project that Netflix created called Chaos Monkey that does a really good job of inserting random chaotic events into your decoupled framework. And so you can plug it into any number of microservices that you have, and you can cause it to blow things up. And it's a really great way of testing the robustness of any individual part of your web application, be that some API that's down, be that some front end chaos and some UI chaos, be that poor delayed responses from other parts of the application. It's a really excellent way at having something that is very holistic for testing your web app. So, all of this is to talk about building that miserable path and building that happy path covers nearly everything in between. Now, it doesn't mean that it's 100%, right? Like there are definitely times where you're going to want to have humans be working and touching in some of those median pathways, especially those that are really important to particular user groups that are feeling underserved. And so make sure that you pair the strategies for the miserable path with good data that shows like who you might be ignoring. Gathering this information and then making sure that you're thinking about all of those different user use cases, you can apply even more pathways than just the happy path and the miserable path. You can look at a few of those that are in between as well. And the more pathways that you're able to cover, the more complete and comprehensive you're going to be building your web application for your actual users, not just the in-group of people that are creating them. And so with that, I'd love to kill my big screen and talk some questions with you guys.
Hey, so we've got a question coming in from Ian here on the chat. Ian says, I've been working on an app for the age group of 65 and up. Are there any suggestions for testing in regards to what you presented today about happy paths versus miserable paths?
Yeah. So, I like the way that I would do it is a pretty extensive, right? Like as a company at Knapsack, we predominantly deal with like pretty large enterprise customers. And so we would actually go and do some research around like, okay, how does a 65-year-old navigate this particular app experience, or can I screen record them with like LogRocket or some other sort of logging application that tracks their clicks and tracks the movements around the screen to really understand what's happening. I think that one of the things to think about with especially that age group of people is you have a lot of people that have a pretty low understanding of the internet, and this is again a little bit stereotypical. This doesn't mean anybody or everybody by any means, but you have folks that are typically on older hardware that don't have the deep technical knowledge that you normally would, and so thinking about how you put yourselves in those shoes, like you're going to want to have something that you can see with the zoom turned up to 400% at the same time that you have like a resolution that is set to like 640 by 480 because nobody's ever showed somebody how to change that. And so there's a lot of these sort of like specific demographic testing areas that I might as well call out. You do have to be a little bit careful with, right? Because you don't want to base everything around your testing around stereotypes. There are certainly very technically savvy 65-year-olds that are out there in the world. But in general, like what are some of the common issues that this group faces that you want to account for as a part of that test?
Wonderful. Any other questions for Chris? You know what? I've got one for you, Chris. While I was listening to your presentation, one of the things that I found really interesting was your choice of the word miserable. So I'm kind of curious, just to dig into that a little bit. As you said yourself, very, very eloquently, we talk a lot about the happy path, and I loved your recommendation of starting from the worst possible path and optimizing from that context. So it's kind of a two-part question, which is, why the word miserable? Is there kind of some additional, because we hear, sad paths or, disruptive paths or things like that. But the word miserable really jumped out to me. So I'm kind of curious if you could explain that a little bit.
Yeah. So this is an Evan Lovelyism, which is, yeah, and it is more fun, Matt. But I think that like when we think about, kind of the, setting out on a backpacking trip, say, right? You think about like, what is the thing that gets you to your destination? There's, it's not the easy path and it's not the hard path. Like the hard path might be up some rocky terrain or whatever. It's the miserable path because like, there's snow and there's rain and your backpack rips and your shoelaces break and everything like that. And so the idea is it's like, it's trying to go beyond the idea of non-ideal into the realm of like trying to fundamentally shift your thinking to a much more worst case scenario kind of guidepost. And Evan is very avid outdoors guy, and so when he thinks about stuff like that, he thinks about like what is all the things that could go wrong and modeling all those things that could go wrong. So it's not just like what's a bad or a challenging base case. It's like, what are all of the possible things that could be awful about that experience that you need to account for?
I think that the illustration of, worst case scenario and going in that direction really solidifies for me exactly that kind of notion of miserableness. We've got another question coming in from Brittany here. How long do you spend doing user research, more in the UX realm? Do you do research while developing, or do you mostly do it beforehand? There's lots of schools of thought around this.
Yeah. Our opinion on this is that research is something that is kind of never done. And so, you do have that initial rush where you're trying to like frame out exactly like what your audiences are, about what are the needs of particular groups of people, but the research should be something that you conduct on an ongoing basis. Now, on the agency front, that's sometimes really challenging because sometimes people don't have budget for that, and so some upfront research is all that you can get done. But in the best organizations that lead the way in these areas, and I think with a lot of product focused organizations, baking that research and UX philosophy into your quarterly or semi-annual cycles tends to be the best. And you have that again, that initial push, and then you have that revalidation with every cycle. And you're going to uncover new learnings as well that you're going to want to have like new research happening, right? So hey, maybe a new demographic springs up of lizard people, and you need to understand the lizard person mentality. You're going to want to probably conduct some more thorough research on that new audience group that just showed up.